The steam rising from Vat-73 carries the molecular signature of approximately 14,000 human beings. I know this because I have been breathing them for 37 years. The vapor condenses on my skin, in my lungs, coating the inside of my mouth with a film that tastes like copper and rendered fat. My name is Matthias Cole, and I am standing on platform 12 with a 20-foot stirring pole in my hands, breaking apart a clump of what used to be someone's pelvis, so it doesn't jam the intake grinders. The bone fragments catch the red emergency lighting and glitter like gems as they dissolve back into the soup. But let me tell you how I got here, to this moment, to this bridge suspended over a lake of boiling human matter, to this life where I stir the dead so the living can eat, knowing that one day I will slide into this same vat and some other man will break my bones apart with the same industrial detachment I've cultivated like a survival skill. I was 19 when they selected me. That sounds young until you understand that on Hive World Mortis 13, 19 years old makes you practically ancient. Most children born in the lower hive levels die before their 10th birthday from malnutrition, industrial accidents, or simply being in the wrong corridor when a gang war erupts. I had survived by being small, quiet, and useful to my father, who worked in the water reclamation tunnels, fixing the corroded pipes that carried grey water from the upper hives down to our level. He taught me to read technical diagrams by candlelight in our HAB unit, a single room we shared with my two brothers, sleeping in shifts because there was only one bed, and someone always had to be awake to guard our possessions. My father's hands were permanently stained black from the chemical sludge he worked with, the skin cracked and bleeding in places where the industrial waste had eaten through to the dermis. He never complained. Complaint was inefficient, he said, and inefficiency was noticed by the overseers, and being noticed was how you ended up on the work quota lists that never seemed to shrink no matter how many bodies got fed into the system. He was 41 years old and looked 70, his spine curved from decades of crawling through pipes too narrow for a grown man, his lungs rattling with every breath from the toxic fumes he'd inhaled. I remember one specific night, I must have been 17, when he came back from a shift and sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing his work coveralls that were more patch than original fabric. My brothers were asleep in the corner, curled together for warmth because the heating elements in our unit had failed 6 months prior, and no one was coming to fix them. My father pulled out a small piece of metal from his pocket, a gear maybe 3 inches across, machined with precise teeth that caught the candlelight. "Found this in Sector 47, he said, turning it over in his ruined hands. "Still perfect after Emperor knows how long. Whoever made this, they made it to last. They made it right." He handed it to me, and I felt the weight of it, the cold metal warming slowly against my palm. That's the dream, Matthias. Make something that lasts. Leave something behind that says you were here, that you mattered, that you weren't just consumed and forgotten. I kept that gear. I hid it in a crack in the wall behind where I slept, wrapped in a piece of cloth my father had given me. It was the only thing I owned that served no practical purpose, the only object in my life that existed simply because it was beautiful and well made. I would take it out sometimes when I couldn't sleep, feel the perfect teeth, imagine the hands that had crafted it with such precision. 2 years later, the labor conscription teams came through our sector. They came every few months, checking identification chips, scanning work records, looking for able-bodied males to fill quotas in the manufacturums and processing plants that kept the hive functioning. The administratum ran the Imperium on quotas. So many tons of material produced, so many calories processed, so many bodies assigned to so many tasks in an endless calculation that stretched across the galaxy. We were numbers in a ledger, and the ledger always had to balance. They found me in the water reclamation tunnel where I'd been helping my father replace a corroded valve. I was bent over a pipe junction, my hands black with the same chemical filth that had destroyed my father's skin, when the handheld scanner beeped, and the overseer, a massive man with augmetic eyes that clicked and whirred as they focused, grabbed me by the shoulder. "Matthias Cole, Age 19, no specialized skills notation, general labor category, he read from the screen. You're assigned to Nutrition Processing Plant 77 Alpha, Corpse-Starch Production Division. Report to intake processing in 4 hours. My father stood up from where he'd been working, his wrench still in his hand. For a moment I thought he might swing it, might try to fight, but he just stood there with his shoulders slumped and that rattle in his chest getting louder. He's assigned to water reclamation, my father said, his voice careful, respectful. His training certification is filed with superseded by nutritional production emergency quota, the overseer interrupted, not even looking at him. Hive population increase of 47,000 in the last quarter. Corpse-Starch demand exceeds current production capacity by 12%. Additional labor units required immediately. The mathematics of it were beautiful in their cruelty. More people meant more food needed, but more people also meant more bodies when those people died, which meant more raw material for the corpse-starch, which would feed more people, who would eventually die and become food themselves. A perfect closed loop, endlessly sustainable, horrifically efficient. The administrator had calculated how many stirrers were needed to process how many corpses to feed how many citizens, and I was simply a number that balanced an equation. Can I started to ask if I could say goodbye to my brothers, but the overseer was already walking away, his augmetic legs carrying him with mechanical precision toward the next conscription target. My father pulled me into a brief embrace, his arms thin but strong from decades of manual labor. He smelled like chemicals and sweat and the recycled air of the lower hive. Keep your head down, he whispered against my ear. Do the work, survive. That's all any of us can do. I wanted to tell him about the gear, about how I'd treasured it, about how I understood what he'd been trying to teach me about craft and permanence and meaning. But the words caught in my throat. And then the conscription team was shouting for me to move, and I was being herded with 24 other young men toward the transit tunnels that would take us to the processing plants. I never saw my father again. I learned later, years later, when I still cared enough to inquire, that he died 8 months after my conscription. A pipe burst in Sector 47, the same place where he'd found that perfect gear, and flooded the tunnel with superheated chemical waste. They said he died instantly, though the records indicated his body was recovered and processed through standard channels, which meant he went into the vats just like everyone else. I've spent many nights since then wondering if I ever stirred his bones, if some fragment of the man who taught me to read and dream and hope for permanence passed through my hands as an anonymous clump of calcium deposits to be broken apart and dissolved. The intake processing for Nutrition Processing Plant 77 Alpha took 6 hours. They lined us up in a corridor that stretched for half a mile, bare rockcrete walls weeping condensation. The air thick with industrial smells I couldn't identify yet but would become intimately familiar with. Rendered fat, bone meal, chemical preservatives, steam from the boiling vats. Every 30 minutes they'd move us forward 50 feet. Through checkpoints where servitors scanned our identification chips and recorded our biometric data with mechanical efficiency. When I finally reached the front of the line, a tech priest, or what I assumed was a tech priest based on the extensive augmetics and the symbol of the Mechanicus embossed on his robes, processed my assignment. Half his face was human, pale skin stretched tight over bone, one organic eye that was a pale blue. The other half was chrome and brass, with multiple optical lenses that clicked and rotated as he examined me. "Vat-Stirrer 3rd Class," he announced in a voice that sounded like it was coming through a Vox speaker. "Duty shift, 18 hours. Rest cycle, 6 hours. Nutritional allotment, 2,000 calories per day, corpse-starch based. Clothing, standard issue work coveralls replaced monthly. Equipment. 1 stirring pole, 1 particle mask, 1 pair of thermal-resistant gloves. Life expectancy, 4.3 years. That last part, he said, with no more emotion than when he'd listed my calorie allotment. 4.3 years. The average Vat-Stirrer lasted 4.3 years before the work killed them. from falls into the vats, from respiratory failure caused by inhaling vaporized human matter, from exhaustion-induced accidents, from any of 1,000 industrial hazards that the administratum had calculated and averaged into a neat statistical projection. They told us the Emperor protects, but apparently his protection had a 4-year expiration date for men assigned to stir corpses. We were issued our equipment from a servitor that might have been human once but was now mostly mechanical arms, and a torso hardwired into an alcove in the wall. It handed out coveralls from a pile that never seemed to diminish, grey fabric stiff with industrial starch and old sweat. The particle masks were supposed to filter the air, but I would learn they only blocked the largest particles, letting the molecular vapor of dissolved humans coat your respiratory tract with a film you could never fully cough out. The gloves were thick rubber that went up to your elbows, but the heat from the vats would eventually crack and melt them, necessitating replacement every few weeks. The stirring pole was 20 feet of reinforced alloy with a broad, flat blade at the end, like a primitive farming implement scaled up to industrial proportions. It weighed 40 pounds. You had to be strong to use it effectively, but not so strong that you'd waste valuable calories on unnecessary muscle mass. The administratum had calculated the optimal body type for a Vat-Stirrer: lean, wiry, efficient. I fit the parameters perfectly. They marched us, 37 new conscripts, through corridors that descended deeper into the hive's industrial bowels. The temperature increased with every level we went down, from the cold damp of the mid-hive to a humid heat that made breathing feel like drowning. The walls changed from rockcrete to bare metal, bulkheads that sweated condensation and were stained with rust and something else, something organic that had been baked onto the surface by decades of exposure to fat-laden steam. That supervisor, Hendrik, met us on level 93, in a chamber so large I couldn't see the far wall through the haze of steam. He was a thick man with arms like industrial pistons, his face scarred by old burns, one ear missing entirely. He'd been a Vat-Stirrer for 16 years, he told us, which meant he'd somehow survived 4 times longer than the average. That made him either incredibly skilled or incredibly lucky, and from the way he moved, with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned every possible way a job could kill you, I suspected it was the former. "You are standing in processing chamber 7, he announced, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of machinery and boiling liquid. This chamber contains 100 vats, each capable of processing 15,000 kilograms of raw organic material per day. Your job is to ensure continuous operation. That means breaking up bone fragments, skimming particulate matter, maintaining thermal equilibrium, and preventing mechanical failures that would reduce production efficiency." He walked along the line of us, examining each new conscript with the dispassionate eye of someone evaluating tools. The vats operate at 98 degrees Celsius. The steam will burn exposed skin. The fumes contain render byproducts that will damage your lungs. The platforms are slick with condensed fat. Falls are common. Rescue from the vats is not attempted. The temperature would kill you in seconds, and stopping production to recover a body would impact quota fulfillment. He stopped in front of me, his one good eye studying my face. "What's your name?" "Matthias Cole, sir." "Don't call me sir. I work for a living. You're assigned to VAT 73, Platform 12. Your trainer is going to show you the procedures once, maybe twice if he's feeling generous. After that, you either figure it out or you fall in. Questions?" I had 1,000 questions. I asked none of them. "Good. Follow your assignments. Fulfill your quotas. The Imperium needs 10 million tons of Corpse-Starch produced from this plant annually to feed Hive Mortis 13. Every kilogram you fail to produce is a citizen who starves. Remember that when you're tired. Remember that when the steam burns your skin. Remember that when you're standing on that platform at hour 16 of your shift and your arms are shaking so badly you can barely hold the pole. They claimed it gave us purpose, that we were serving the Emperor by feeding his people. They alleged our labor was sacred, that transforming death into sustenance was holy work. The propaganda screens mounted on the chamber walls displayed scrolling text, "From death Life, from sacrifice, sustenance. The Emperor provides through your labor. That's what they always say. Not that we provide through brutal labor, not that a system built on grinding corpses into food is sustained by breaking our bodies in turn. The Emperor provides as if this nightmare is divine will rather than the logical endpoint of an empire that consumes its own citizens to survive. My trainer was a man named Caspian, 42 years old, missing 3 fingers on his left hand from an accident he didn't elaborate on. He'd been stirring vats for 7 years, making him a genuine ancient in this profession, a statistical anomaly that had survived almost twice the projected life expectancy. He handed me my stirring pole and led me to platform 12 without saying a word, his movements economical and practiced. Vat-73 stretched out below us, a circular pool of bubbling brown-gray liquid, approximately 50 meters in diameter. The surface roiled with constant motion, thermal currents carrying darker clumps to the surface where they'd float for a moment before sinking back down. The heat was immediate and overwhelming, even with the particle mask on, even standing 6 feet above the surface. Sweat broke out across my body within seconds, soaking through the stiff coveralls. "That's your kingdom," Caspian said, gesturing at the vat. "Everything that happens in there is your responsibility. You see those darker patches?" He pointed at several areas where the liquid was thicker, less fluid. "Those are bone clusters, pelvis usually, or skull fragments. Sometimes whole spines if they came from the upper hive and had good nutrition. They don't break down as fast as the soft tissue. Your job is to break them apart before they reach the intake grinders down there." He pointed at the center of the vat, where I could see the dark opening of a drain. Machinery beneath pulling the liquid down to be filtered and processed into the pale blocks of corpse-starch that would be distributed throughout the hive. The grinders can handle small bones, fingers, ribs, that kind of thing. But anything larger will jam them. And a jammed grinder means production stops, and stopped production means you get reported for efficiency violations, and 3 efficiency violations means you get reassigned. "Reassigned to where?" I asked. Caspian looked at me with something that might have been pity. "Into the vat, usually, either as punishment or because they work you until you fall. Doesn't much matter which. The end result is the same. You become part of tomorrow's production quota." He demonstrated the technique, lowering his stirring pole into the liquid, the blade disappearing beneath the surface. The pole had marks along its length, measurements in feet and meters. He found a bone cluster by feel. I could see it in the way the pole suddenly met resistance, and then began working it, breaking the mass apart with systematic strikes. Fragments floated to the surface, smaller now, manageable, and the thermal currents carried them away toward the grinders. "Always check the depth," he said. "The measurements on the pole tell you how much material is in the vat. Too shallow, and you're not processing fast enough. Too deep, and you risk overflow, which is how people die. Slip on the platform, fall into 3 feet of boiling human soup, can't get back out because there's nothing solid to grab onto. I've seen it happen 6 times in 7 years. Takes about 40 seconds for the screaming to stop." He handed me the pole. "Your shift starts now, 18 hours. Break every 3 hours for water. You'll find a dispenser on the wall over there. Don't drink too much, or you'll need to piss. And the nearest facilities are a 10-minute walk, which means leaving your station, which counts as an efficiency violation if an overseer notices. Most of us learn to just piss off the platform into the vat. Adds to the composition." He said this with no humor, just stating a fact. "What about food?" I asked. "After your shift, they'll distribute your ration in the barracks. 2,000 calories of corpse-starch. You'll learn not to think too hard about what it's made from, or you'll starve yourself. And starving is slower than falling but just as certain." He left me there, on platform 12, with my stirring pole and my particle mask, and the overwhelming understanding that this was my life now. Below me, the vat bubbled and steamed, the liquid surface occasionally splitting to reveal a flash of something recognizable, the curve of a rib cage. the hollow socket of an eye. A hand floating palm up, as if reaching for salvation before the currents pulled it back under. I lowered my pole into the liquid and felt it sink through layers of different viscosity. Thinner near the top where the fat separated and formed a kind of film, thicker deeper down where the particulate matter accumulated. 6 feet down, the blade hit something solid. I pushed, levering the pole like Caspian had shown me, and felt whatever it was shift and break apart. Fragments surfaced, and I saw clearly that one of them was a section of jawbone. 3 teeth still attached, before it rolled and sank back into the soup. The steam rose constantly, carrying heat and moisture and the molecular vapor of dissolved humans. Within 10 minutes, my coveralls were soaked through with sweat. Within 30 minutes, my arms were aching from the repetitive motion. Lower the pole, find resistance, break it apart, lift the pole, repeat. Within an hour, the particle mask felt like it was suffocating me. The rubber sealed tight against my face, my breath hot and recycled. But taking it off would mean breathing unfiltered air, and the consequences Caspian had implied but not detailed. The vat never stopped bubbling. The material never stopped needing to be stirred. The intake grinders hummed constantly beneath the surface, pulling liquid down to be processed, creating currents that brought new bone clusters up from the depths where they'd settled. I fell into a rhythm. Probe, break, lift, shift position, probe again. My world narrowed to the circle of liquid below me. The weight of the pole in my hands, the heat that made every breath feel like I was drowning. At hour 3, I took my first break, stumbling to the water dispenser on legs that trembled with fatigue. The water was lukewarm and tasted like metal and chemicals, but I drank it gratefully, letting it wash the coating of rendered fat from my mouth. Around me, dozens of other Vat-Stirrers worked their own platforms, each one a solitary figure silhouetted against the steam, performing the same motions I was performing, living the same nightmare I was living. We didn't speak to each other. Speech required energy, and energy was a finite resource carefully calculated by the administratum to be just enough for survival and work. Nothing extra for social connection or comfort, or any of the things that make life bearable. We were components in a machine, and machines don't socialize. I returned to platform 12 and resumed stirring. Hour 4, hour 5, my back screaming. Hour 6, a bone cluster that fought my pole, something large and dense that I had to work for 10 minutes to break apart. Finally shattering it into pieces and seeing that it was a pelvis, the bone thick and solid, probably from someone who'd lived in the mid-hive where nutrition was better. Hour 7. The muscles in my shoulders burning with accumulated lactic acid. Hour 8. Halfway through my shift and I wanted to cry, but didn't have the moisture to spare for tears. At hour 9 I watched a man, 3 platforms over, lose his grip on his stirring pole. It slipped from his hands, the blade end still submerged in his vat, the handle end clattering against the metal platform before sliding over the edge and disappearing into the boiling liquid. He stood there for a moment, staring at where his pole had vanished, and I saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. Report the loss and face punishment, or try to retrieve it and risk falling in himself, or simply walk away and accept whatever consequences came from abandoning his station. He chose to walk away. An overseer noticed within 5 minutes the crack of his voice audible even over the ambient noise of the chamber. Efficiency violation. Station abandonment. Security to platform 47. I didn't see what happened to him. I forced myself to look back at my own vat, to focus on my own work, because caring about someone else's fate was a luxury I couldn't afford. The system was designed this way: isolated workers, each responsible only for their own survival, no collective action possible because collective action required communication and organization and energy we didn't have. They alleged this was necessary, that feeding billions of hive citizens required this level of efficiency, that the alternative was starvation on a planetary scale. The propaganda continued scrolling on the screens. Your labor feeds the Imperium. The Emperor protects through your sacrifice. The Emperor protects, I thought bitterly, breaking apart what I was fairly certain was someone's ribcage. He protects everyone except the men who stir corpses for 18 hours a day, until their bodies give out and they slide into the same vats they've been tending. That's not protection. That's consumption. That's a system that eats its own maintenance workers. Hour 12. My hands were blistering inside the thermal gloves, the friction and heat combining to raise fluid-filled welts across my palms. Hour 13. I took my second water break, barely able to hold the cup, my fingers cramping around the pole when I returned to work. Hour 14. A bone cluster that turned out to be someone's entire arm, the hand still intact, fingers curled as if gripping something invisible. I broke it apart methodically, reducing it to pieces small enough for the grinders, trying not to think about whose arm it was, whether they'd been old or young, whether they'd had dreams like my father's dream of making something permanent. Hour 15. I understood with sudden clarity why the average life expectancy was 4.3 years. This wasn't work that would kill you dramatically in an accident. This was work that would grind you down cell by cell, shift by shift, your body consuming itself to meet the energy demands, while the administratum fed you exactly enough to keep you functional, but not enough to truly recover. You would get weaker over months and years, your grip would fail, your legs would give out, and you'd fall. Or you'd collapse from exhaustion. Or your lungs would finally surrender to the accumulated damage from breathing vaporized humans. The method didn't matter. The end result was identical. Hour 16. My vision was starting to blur, fatigue producing the same cognitive effects as intoxication. The vat seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, the liquid surface breathing like a living thing. I caught myself swaying and forced my legs to lock, terrified that unconsciousness would take me and I'd pitch forward into the boiling soup. Hour 17. I thought about my father's gear, about precision and craftsmanship and permanence. This was the opposite of that dream. This was the most disposable work imaginable, stirring garbage to make garbage that would be eaten by people who would become garbage in turn. Nothing permanent, nothing beautiful, just endless consumption and excretion, life and death blurred into a closed loop of rendered fat and broken bones. Hour 18. The shift change alarm sounded, a klaxon that cut through the chamber's ambient noise. I lifted my stirring pole from the vat for the last time, my arms trembling so badly I nearly dropped it, and secured it in the bracket mounted on the platform railing. Around me, 3 dozen other stirrers were doing the same, all of us moving with the jerky imprecision of exhaustion. We'd been replaced by the next shift, fresh men who looked as terrified as I'd felt 18 hours ago. And I felt a spike of something that might have been sympathy or might have been schadenfreude. Welcome to hell, newcomers. We're all cooking in this pot together. The barracks were a long room with bunks stacked 3 high. No privacy, no personal space. Just metal frames and thin mattresses that smelled like industrial chemicals and old sweat. Each bunk had a small locker beneath it for personal possessions, though I had none to store. The gear my father had given me was still hidden in our HAB unit in the lower hive, and I'd likely never see it again. That hurt more than my blistered hands or my aching back. The knowledge that the one beautiful thing I'd owned was lost, that the dream it represented had been as disposable as everything else. They distributed our rations, blocks of corpse-starch the size of my fist, pale gray-brown with a texture somewhere between bread and meat. The smell was familiar because it was the same smell that filled the processing chamber, the same smell that coated my skin and my lungs. I was about to eat the very substance I'd been producing for 18 hours, to consume the dead so I could continue processing the dead, to perpetuate the cycle for as long as my body held out. The first bite tasted like nothing and everything simultaneously. Bland, but with undertones I recognized from the steam, from the vat, from breathing vaporized human matter all day. My stomach rebelled, churning with nausea. But I forced myself to eat because the alternative was slow starvation, and I'd already decided that if I was going to die in this place, it wouldn't be from giving up. It would be from the work, because at least that death would mean I'd tried. Around me, other men were eating with the mechanical efficiency of those who'd long since stopped thinking about what they were consuming. Some were from my intake group, first-day conscripts learning the same horrible lesson I was learning. Others had been here longer, weeks, months, the scarred veterans like Caspian who'd somehow lasted years. No one spoke. Conversation required energy we needed for tomorrow's shift. I finished my ration and climbed into an assigned bunk, middle tier, near the back of the barracks. The mattress was thin enough that I could feel the metal frame beneath it. But after 18 hours standing on a metal platform, even this was luxury. I closed my eyes and immediately the vat was there behind my eyelids. The bubbling liquid, the floating bones, the heat and steam and the knowledge that this was my life now, that tomorrow I'd wake and do it again, and the day after that, and the day after that. For 4.3 years on average, until the work consumed me like I'd been consuming the dead. Sleep came like drowning, pulling me under into dreams filled with steam and bones, and the taste of rendered human fat. The first month taught me that the human body can adapt to almost anything if the alternative is death. My hands stopped blistering after the second week. The skin thickened into calluses that could grip the stirring pole without tearing. My lungs adjusted to the steam, developing a permanent wheeze but no longer triggering the violent coughing fits that had doubled me over during those initial shifts. My legs learned to lock into position for hours at a time, muscles developing the specific endurance required for standing in one place while performing repetitive motions. I was becoming optimized for my function, my body reshaping itself into a more efficient tool. The work was always the same. 18-hour shifts, 6 hours of rest, 2,000 calories of corpse-starch that I no longer tasted because my taste buds had been burned away by constant exposure to fat-laden steam. Platform 12. Vat 73. Lower the pole, find resistance, break it apart, lift the pole, repeat. The vat never stopped bubbling. The grinders never stopped pulling material down to be processed. The intake pipes never stopped delivering new corpses from collection points throughout the hive. I learned the patterns. Morning deliveries were mostly from the lower hive, malnutrition victims, accident casualties, the elderly who'd finally succumbed to accumulated toxin exposure. Their bones were thin, hollow, easy to break. Afternoon deliveries came from the manufacturers, industrial accidents, workers who'd been caught in machinery or crushed by falling cargo. Their bones were denser, required more effort. Evening deliveries were the criminals, the executed, those who'd violated some administrative regulation and been processed through the justice system directly into the nutrition cycle. Sometimes these bodies were whole, sometimes they came in pieces depending on the method of execution. I stopped thinking of them as people after the first month. That was a survival mechanism, a psychological adaptation as necessary as my physical calluses. If I let myself remember that each bone cluster had been someone with a name, with a father maybe, with dreams of permanence and meaning, I would have gone insane. Instead, they became objects, raw material to be processed, obstacles to efficient production, problems to be solved with my stirring pole. The other Vat-Stirrers and I developed a kind of silent communication. We couldn't afford actual conversation, but we learned to read each other's body language. A man slumping on his platform meant exhaustion approaching the dangerous threshold. A man moving too quickly, frantically, meant he was panicking, losing the rhythm, about to make a mistake. A man standing perfectly still for too long meant he'd mentally checked out, and someone needed to throw a piece of debris at him to snap him back to awareness before an overseer noticed. Caspian taught me other things during our brief overlaps between shifts. He showed me how to read the vat's temperature by the size of the bubbles. Small and frequent meant too hot. Adjust the thermal controls down. Large and infrequent meant too cool. Adjust up. He taught me to identify different bone types by how they felt through the pole skulls, had a distinctive hollow resistance. Pelvises were solid and heavy. Spines had a segmented quality that you could feel as the vertebrae separated. "You're doing better than most," he told me one day during month 2, his voice rough from decades of breathing bad air. Most new conscripts don't make it past the first month. They fall, or they quit, or they just stop eating and waste away. You've got that look, though, like you're angry. Angry is good. Angry keeps you alive longer than hope. I realized he was right. I was angry. Furious, actually, in a cold, deep way that had replaced whatever optimism I'd possessed before conscription. Angry at the system that ground people into food. Angry at the overseers who watched us with augmatic eyes and recorded efficiency violations. Angry at the tech priests who maintained the machinery with more care than they showed the human workers. Angry at the propaganda screens that continued scrolling their lies. The Emperor protects. Your sacrifice sustains the Imperium. The Emperor protects, I thought every time I saw those words. They told us that in a million different ways, through a million different channels. The preachers who occasionally visited the processing plant spoke of sacred duty and divine purpose. The administrative officials who calculated our quotas referred to our work as holy service. Even the ration distribution was framed as the Emperor's provision, as if the Corpse-Starch appeared through divine miracle rather than through the mechanized rendering of human corpses. But I saw the truth every day, 18 hours a day, stirring the soup. The Emperor wasn't protecting anyone in this chamber. The system was protecting itself, perpetuating its own existence by converting death into sustenance in an endless cycle. We were components in a machine that had no purpose beyond its own continuation, and calling that divine was just another control mechanism, another way to make us accept the unacceptable. Month 3 brought my first major injury. I was working hour 14 of my shift, fatigue making my movements sloppy, when I encountered a particularly stubborn bone cluster deep in the vat. I levered the pole hard, putting my full body weight into it, and whatever I was trying to break apart suddenly gave way. The pole shot upward, the momentum carrying it in an arc that I couldn't control, and the blade caught me across the left forearm as it swung past. The thermal-resistant rubber had melted in spots from constant exposure to steam, creating thin patches. The blade found one of these patches and cut through, opening a gash from my wrist to my elbow. Blood welled immediately, running down my arm, dripping from my fingers into the vat below, where it mixed with the bubbling liquid and disappeared. I should have stopped, should have called for medical assistance, should have at least wrapped the wound. But stopping meant leaving my station, which meant an efficiency violation, which meant getting closer to the 3-strike limit that would result in termination. And in this job, termination meant the vat. So I kept working, blood running down my arm, soaking into the rubber glove, making my grip slippery. The pain was intense for the first hour, then faded to a dull throb, then became just another sensation to be ignored along with the heat and the fatigue and the ache in my back. At the end of the shift, I went to the medical station, a small alcove staffed by a servitor that was more medical equipment than human. It scanned my wound with optical sensors, determined the damage was non-critical, and applied a chemical sealant that burned worse than the original cut. No stitches, no antiseptic, just industrial adhesive to hold the edges of the wound together while it healed on its own. The servitor stamped my record with a medical incident notation and sent me back to the barracks. The wound got infected within 3 days. I could see the red streak spreading up my arm, could feel the heat of inflammation radiating from the sealed gash, could smell the sweet rot odor of tissue beginning to necrotize. But reporting back to medical would mean another notation on my record, would mark me as injury-prone, which was how workers got classified as inefficient and quietly reassigned. So I said nothing, did nothing, just kept stirring vats while my arm slowly poisoned itself. Caspian noticed during week 2 of the infection. "That's going to kill you," he said, looking at my arm during a water break. The skin was mottled purple and red, the sealed wound weeping fluid that smelled like decay. "Probably," I agreed. "You could report it. They'd treat it." Older method. From before the administratum standardized medical procedures. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of metal, filed down to a sharp edge. "Heat it in the steam until it glows. Cut away the infected tissue. Seal it again with your own hand. Burns hurt less than rot, and it's faster. I stared at the improvised blade, at Caspian's scarred face, and realized this was how he'd survived 16 years. Not by following the official procedures, but by developing his own brutal pragmatism. By making choices that would horrify anyone in the upper hive, but made perfect sense down here, where efficiency violations were death sentences. That night, after shift, I held the metal blade in the steam rising from Vat-73 until the edge glowed red. Then I cut into my own arm, carving away the infected tissue in strips that fell into the vat below, adding my own corruption to the soup. The pain was extraordinary, beyond anything I'd experienced, but pain was temporary and death was permanent. When I'd removed all the discolored flesh, I pressed the hot metal against the wound, cauterizing it, the smell of my own burning meat mixing with all the other smells I'd learned to ignore. The wound healed after that. Badly, the scar tissue was thick and ropey, restricting movement in my wrist. But it healed. I'd mutilated myself to stay functional, had literally cut away parts of my body to remain productive, and the horrible thing was that it worked. I was back to full efficiency within a week, stirring corpses with slightly reduced range of motion but acceptable performance metrics. That was when I started to understand what was really happening to me. The physical adaptations, the calluses, the lung adjustments, the muscle development, those were just the surface. Underneath, something deeper was changing. My thought patterns were simplifying, optimizing themselves for the work. I stopped having complex emotions. Anger remained because anger was useful. But hope disappeared, joy disappeared, curiosity disappeared. I stopped wondering about things that didn't relate directly to vat-stirring. I stopped remembering my father's face with any clarity. I stopped dreaming about anything except the vat, the pole, the endless repetitive motion. I was becoming a better tool by becoming less human. Month 6 marked the first time I witnessed someone go into the vat while still alive. His name was Torvin, one of the conscripts from my intake group. He'd been assigned to Vat 81, 3 platforms over from mine. I'd watched him deteriorating over the previous weeks, moving slower, taking longer breaks, the classic signs of someone approaching system failure. During hour 12 of a particularly brutal shift, he simply let go of his stirring pole and stepped off the platform. He didn't slip, didn't stumble, he chose it. One moment he was standing there working, the next he was falling, his body hitting the boiling liquid with a splash that sent droplets spattering across the surrounding platforms. He screamed, but only for maybe 30 seconds. Caspian had been accurate about the timeline. The thermal shock probably killed him quickly, unconsciousness from pain before actual death. His body thrashed, arms flailing, trying to find purchase on nothing, and then the currents pulled him under, and he was gone. Production didn't stop. The overseer noted the incident, recorded the efficiency violation for abandoned station, and assigned a replacement worker within 10 minutes. Torvin's body stayed in the vat, processing along with all the other corpses, his bones eventually rising to the surface as fragments that I or another stirrer would break apart with our poles. He'd become part of the product he'd been producing, the ultimate expression of the system's efficiency. I felt nothing watching him die. That should have horrified me. The fact that a man's death produced no emotional response, but it didn't, because feeling things required energy I didn't have. Emotion was inefficient. Caring was wasteful. The work continued, and the work was all that mattered, and recognizing that truth was the final psychological adaptation necessary for survival. The propaganda screens had it backwards, I realized. They claimed we sustained the Imperium through our labor, but actually, the Imperium sustained itself by consuming us. We weren't workers feeding citizens. We were fuel being burned to keep the machine running, our bodies and minds ground up just as thoroughly as the corpses in the vats. Just over a longer timeline. Month 9 brought the first memory gaps. I would find myself on platform 12 with no recollection of how I'd gotten there, unable to remember the walk from the barracks or the shift change. Time started becoming fluid. I'd be at hour 4 of a shift, and then suddenly it was hour 14, and I had no memory of the intervening 10 hours, only the evidence of worked muscles and a vat that was properly stirred. My body was executing its function while my consciousness went somewhere else, shut down to conserve energy, running minimal processes while the physical components continued operating. Caspian called it going automatic. Happens to everyone who lasts past 6 months, he said. Your brain figures out it doesn't need to be present for the work, so it just goes away for a while, saves energy, makes the time pass faster. You'll get used to it. But I wasn't sure I wanted to get used to it. These missing hours felt like small deaths, pieces of my life excised and discarded. I was losing time, losing continuity, losing the narrative thread that made me a person rather than a machine. When I tried to remember what had happened during my shift, I'd find only fragments, the feel of the pole in my hands, the heat of the steam, the bubbling of the vat, but no coherent sequence. No sense of myself as an actor performing tasks. Just sensations without context, experiences without an experiencer. The preachers would have called this sacred duty if they'd known about it, I thought bitterly. The ultimate sacrifice, not just your body, but your mind, your sense of self, your continuity of consciousness. You don't just die in service to the Imperium. You disappear piece by piece while still alive, your identity dissolved like bones in boiling liquid. Month 12 marked 1 full year. The administratum noted this milestone by increasing my daily caloric ration by 200 calories, a reward for surviving past the first-year threshold, when most conscripts failed. I was now consuming 2,200 calories of Corpse-Starch per day, which meant I was consuming more of the dead, which meant I needed to produce more to justify the increased resource allocation. The system balanced itself through these calculations, always maintaining equilibrium, always ensuring that inputs matched outputs. I'd lost weight, despite the extra calories, my body consuming its own muscle tissue to meet energy demands that exceeded supply. My ribs were visible through my skin, my face gaunt, my arms ropey with lean muscle, and nothing else. I looked like the corpses I was processing, skeletal, wasted, already halfway to being raw material. The mirror in the barracks washroom showed a stranger, someone I didn't recognize, eyes sunken and dull, expression blank even when I tried to make myself smile. Year 2 began with a change in assignment. That Supervisor Hendrik called me aside after my shift and informed me I was being promoted to Senior Vat-Stirrer, which meant I would train new conscripts. This wasn't an honor. It was just a recognition that I'd survived long enough to be useful in a different capacity. Training meant extra duties added to my regular 18-hour shifts. Meant talking when I hadn't used my voice for anything beyond occasional necessity in months. Meant dredging up the energy to care whether the new men lived or died. The first conscript I trained was named Petros, 19 years old, from the same lower hive sector where I'd grown up. He had that look, the fear and confusion and underlying hope that he'd somehow survive this, that he was special, that the statistics wouldn't apply to him. I remembered having that look. It felt like something from a different lifetime, from a different person entirely. Your job is to stir the vat, I told him, my voice harsh from disuse and damage. Break the bones. Keep production flowing. Don't fall in. 4.3 years average life expectancy. Questions? He had the same questions I'd had. I gave him the same non-answers Caspian had given me, because there were no real answers, just procedures to follow and hours to survive. I showed him how to hold the pole, how to read the vat's temperature, how to identify bone clusters by feel. I showed him where to get water, how to pace himself, when to take breaks. I did not tell him about going automatic, about the memory gaps, about how he'd slowly stop being human and start being a component. He'd learn those things himself, or he'd die before they became relevant. Petros lasted 3 weeks. He fell during his morning shift, grabbed for the platform railing, missed, went into VAT 88. I was training another conscript when it happened, watched it from my position 2 platforms over. felt nothing. Production continued. The system maintained equilibrium. Another body added to the soup, another number subtracted from the labor roster, another replacement conscript assigned within the day. I trained 17 men in year 2. 8 of them died. Falls, exhaustion, collapse, one who simply stopped eating and wasted away to nothing over the course of 6 weeks. The others survived, adapted, began their own transformations from human to tool. I watched it happen to each of them, saw the light fade from their eyes, saw their movements become mechanical, saw them stop asking questions or expressing emotion. I was watching my own past, seeing what I'd looked like from the outside during that first year. Caspian died in month 19. Respiratory failure. His lungs finally surrendered to the accumulated damage from 17 years of breathing vaporized humans, and he collapsed on his platform during hour 9 of his shift. They pulled his body away from the vat edge, recorded the termination, and processed him through standard channels. He went into one of the vats, probably not his own, but maybe. The system didn't track those details. I broke apart what might have been his pelvis 3 days later, felt the familiar solid resistance, reduced it to fragments, sent them down to the grinders. He'd survived 17 years, 4 times the average, almost 4 times my current duration, and he'd still died, still been consumed by the system, still ended up as anonymous raw material. His survival hadn't meant anything except that the system extracted more labor from him before converting him to food. There was no escape, no retirement, no reward for longevity. Just more shifts until your body failed. I was 24 years old and felt ancient. My hands were more scar tissue than original skin. My lungs rattled with every breath. My back was permanently curved from years of leaning over vat edges. I went automatic for 12 to 14 hours per shift now, consciousness simply absent, body executing its programmed functions while my mind disappeared somewhere I couldn't identify. When I tried to remember what my father looked like, I found only fragments, black-stained hands, a rattling cough, the vague sense of someone who'd cared about precision. His face was gone from my memory, smoothed away like a bone dissolving in boiling liquid. The gear he'd given me, that perfect piece of machining, that symbol of permanence and craft, I couldn't remember if it had been brass or steel, couldn't recall the exact number of teeth, couldn't picture its weight in my hand. My one beautiful thing had been lost not just physically, but mentally, erased by the cognitive simplification necessary for survival. The dream of making something permanent had been revealed as the fantasy it always was. Nothing was permanent. Everything was consumed. The system ground everything down eventually. Year 3 began with a change I only noticed because another Vat-Stirrer pointed it out. "You're doing it wrong," he said during a water break, a man named Kellen who'd been working the vats for 5 years. "Your stirring pattern. It's too regular, too perfect." I didn't understand what he meant until I forced myself to pay attention during my next shift, to stay present and conscious instead of going automatic. I watched my own hands on the pole and realized he was right. My movements had become completely mechanical, identical cycles repeated with machine precision. Lower the pole to exactly 6 feet 3. Probe in a circular pattern, radius 2 feet. Encounter resistance. 3 strikes to break apart. Lift pole, shift position 4 feet clockwise. Repeat. No variation, no adjustment for conditions. Just programmed execution of optimal procedure. I'd become a servitor without the augmatics. My consciousness reduced to running a simple algorithm. My body performing repetitive tasks with mechanical efficiency. The horror of it was that this was actually more effective than human decision-making. My production metrics had improved as my humanity decreased. The less I thought, the less I felt. The less I existed as a person, the better I performed my function. The administratum noticed. Month 38 brought another notation on my record. Exemplary production efficiency, recommended for mechanicus evaluation. I didn't know what that meant until VAT Supervisor Hendrik explained it during shift change. "They want to augment you," he said. "Wire you into the VAT controls directly. turn you into a permanent fixture. It's considered an honor. You'd be guaranteed nutrition, maintenance, protection from falls. You'd essentially become immortal, consciousness preserved in augmetic systems while your body is slowly replaced with mechanical components. They alleged this was an honor, a reward for superior performance. They told me I'd be serving the Emperor more perfectly, that augmentation was the path to transcendence, that the Mechanicus would preserve my essential self while perfecting my functional capabilities. The propaganda framed it as divine blessing, as if becoming a component in a machine was somehow holy. But I understood what they were really offering. To complete the transformation I'd been undergoing for 3 years, to finish the process of converting me from person to tool, to make permanent what had been gradual. They'd wire my consciousness into the Vat's control systems, lock my body into position on the platform, and I'd stir corpses forever, for centuries, for millennia. Unable to die, unable to escape, unable to do anything except execute my function in an endless loop. I decline, I said. Hendrik looked surprised. You can't decline, it's an assignment. The administratum has calculated that your consciousness patterns are optimal for augmentation. The Mechanicus requires a certain number of processing specialized servitors per quarter, and you meet the criteria. I decline, I repeated, knowing it was useless, knowing that declining an administrative assignment was itself an efficiency violation, knowing that I'd just guaranteed my termination one way or another. Noted and overridden, Hendrik said. Mechanicus intake processing is scheduled for tomorrow, post-shift. You'll report to Augmentation Chamber 7 instead of Barracks. This is mandatory. I returned to Platform 12 for what I knew would be one of my last shifts as something approximating human. Tomorrow they'd take me apart and rebuild me. Would preserve my brain in augmetic housings while replacing my failing body with mechanical components. Would trap whatever remained of my consciousness in an eternal nightmare of stirring corpses until the machinery finally failed thousands of years from now. The vat bubbled below me, steam rising, carrying the molecular signature of approximately 14,000 dissolved humans. I lowered my pole into the liquid and felt it sink through familiar layers. Thin near the top, thick deeper down, 6 feet 3 inches. Circular pattern, resistance encountered. A bone cluster large and dense, probably a pelvis. 3 strikes. 4. 5. It broke apart, fragments surfacing, and I saw clearly in the red emergency lighting that one piece had 3 teeth still attached to a section of jawbone. I looked at those teeth, whole, undissolved, remarkably preserved, and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not emotion exactly, but a kind of clarity, a moment of consciousness breaking through the automatic routines. Those teeth had belonged to someone who'd eaten corpse-starch just like I ate corpse-starch, had probably worked some grinding industrial job just like I worked this grinding industrial job, had probably died and been processed and ended up in my vat, and now I was breaking their jaw apart so they could be converted into food that would feed someone else who would eventually die and be processed in turn. The cycle was perfect, unbreakable, eternal, and tomorrow they were going to lock me into it permanently, make me a fixture in the machine, ensure that I continued serving the system for centuries beyond my natural lifespan. The Emperor protects, the propaganda screen said. The Omnissiah provides through sacred augmentation. Your consciousness will be preserved in holy service, immortality through mechanization. But it was all lies, all control mechanisms, all ways to make the system's victims believe they were blessed rather than consumed. The Emperor wasn't protecting anyone. The Omnissiah wasn't providing salvation. They were just concepts, ideas, stories told to make us accept the unacceptable, to make us cooperate in our own destruction. I lifted my stirring pole from the vat and stood there on platform 12, looking at the bubbling liquid, calculating angles and trajectories and the length of time it would take to drown in boiling human soup. 30 seconds, Caspian had said. Maybe 40. The thermal shock would probably cause unconsciousness quickly. It would hurt, but pain was temporary, and being locked into an augmetic harness for 1,000 years would hurt more in ways that transcended physical sensation. But I didn't step forward, didn't let go of the pole, didn't choose the quick death that Torvin had chosen, because some stubborn fragment of the person I'd been, the boy who'd treasured a perfect gear, who'd believed in craft and permanence and meaning, refused to surrender, refused to validate the system by accepting that it had broken me completely. If they wanted me augmented, they'd have to take me. I wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't make it easy. It was a meaningless gesture in the face of overwhelming systemic power, but it was all I had left. The ability to refuse, to make them expend resources dragging me to my transformation instead of walking willingly into the augmentation chamber. I finished my shift, all 18 hours, stirred the vat with mechanical precision, broke apart bones, maintained production efficiency. At the end, I secured my pole in its bracket and walked toward Augmentation Chamber 7 instead of the barracks, my legs carrying me toward my appointment with permanent horror. The chamber was deep in the plant's mechanical sections, through corridors lined with pipes that hissed and sweated condensation. Tech priests moved through the spaces like red-robed shadows, tending to machinery with reverent care, their augmetic components clicking and whirring. They looked at me as I passed, or rather, their optical sensors tracked my movement, but showed no recognition of me as a person. I was just another component awaiting installation. The augmentation chamber itself was a vast space filled with surgical equipment, mechanical assemblies, and dozens of half-finished servitors in various states of construction. Some were just skulls wired into control boxes. Others were more complete, bodies stripped of flesh, skeletons reinforced with metal, organs replaced with mechanical analogs. All of them were functional, integrated into the plant's systems, serving their purposes with perfect efficiency. A tech priest approached me, this one with more human features remaining than most, a full face, 2 organic eyes, most of one arm still flesh. Matthias Cole, he said, reading from a data slate. Vat-Stirrer, 43 months service, exceptional efficiency ratings. Selected for processing servitor conversion. The procedure will preserve your neural tissue and essential cognitive functions while optimizing your physical form for permanent task integration. I decline, I said again, knowing it was useless. Noted and overridden, he responded with the same formula Hendrik had used. Biological consent is not required for administratum work assignments. Please proceed to Surgical Station 7. 2 servitors, larger than standard, built for restraining rather than processing, moved toward me with mechanical precision. I considered fighting, considered running, but both options would result in the same outcome with more damage to my body in the interim. So I walked to Surgical Station 7 and climbed onto the slab they indicated, lying back on cold metal that was stained with old blood and chemical residue. Restraints closed around my wrists and ankles. Automated systems activating, locking me in place. The tech priest moved into position above me, his augmetic arms extending multiple surgical tools, scalpels, injection needles, cranial drill bits, connection ports. Other tech priests gathered around, beginning their rituals, chanting binary prayers that they genuinely believed would bless the procedure, would invoke the machine god's favor, would sanctify the transformation of flesh into augmetic perfection. The Omnissiah embraces you, the lead tech priest intoned. Your consciousness shall be preserved in eternal service. Your flesh shall be perfected through holy augmentation. You shall become more than human, transcendent in function, immortal in purpose. This is what they believed, I realized. They genuinely thought they were blessing me, elevating me, granting me the gift of immortality through mechanization. They couldn't see, or wouldn't see, that they were creating a nightmare, that preserving consciousness in a servitor body was creating an eternal prison. That immortality without agency or freedom or hope was a fate worse than any death. The injection needles descended, puncturing my skin at dozens of points, pumping chemicals into my bloodstream. Anesthetic to paralyze, but not unconscious. They needed my neural tissue active during the integration process. Chemical preservatives to prevent tissue death, immunosuppressants to prevent rejection of the augmetic components they were about to install. I felt my body going numb from the extremities inward, sensation disappearing from my fingers and toes, creeping up my limbs toward my core. But my mind remained clear, consciousness trapped in a paralyzed body, unable to move or speak, but aware of everything happening. The cranial drill activated with a high-pitched whine. I felt pressure on my skull, felt vibration transmitting through bone, felt the awful sensation of the drill bit cutting through the top of my head, opening my skull to expose my brain. No pain, the chemicals prevented that, but the knowledge of what was happening, the understanding that they were opening me like a piece of machinery to access my core components. The chanting continued, binary prayers mixing with technical specifications, the tech priests speaking of holy integration and blessed circuitry while they methodically dismantled my body. I felt them removing my eyes, pressure, then release, then darkness, felt them cutting into my spine, installing connection ports between my vertebrae, felt them opening my chest, removing my failing lungs and heart, replacing them with mechanical analogs that would pump and oxygenate indefinitely. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time became meaningless in the darkness behind my removed eyes. Sensation reduced to pressure and vibration, and the distant awareness of my body being taken apart and reconstructed. My consciousness floated in chemical calm, the preservatives preventing panic, keeping me stable while they worked. And then something happened that the tech priests hadn't calculated for. Some interaction between the preservative chemicals and my brain's specific neurotransmitter balance, some cascade failure in my limbic system that had been slowly deteriorating from 3 years of malnutrition and chronic stress. My consciousness fragmented, splitting into parallel processes, awareness dividing and subdividing like cells undergoing mitosis. I was suddenly experiencing time non-linearly, perceiving past and present and extrapolated future simultaneously. I could feel myself on Platform 12 stirring the vat 3 years ago, and also now on the surgical slab being converted, and also centuries from now locked into augmetic systems, stirring the same vat in an endless loop. All versions of myself existed simultaneously, all experiencing their own subjective horror. All aware of the others. The tech priests noticed the anomaly. I heard them through sensors I didn't yet understand how to process. Neural pattern fragmentation detected. Consciousness distribution exceeding normal parameters. This may impact integration efficiency. Proceed anyway, another voice commanded. The quota requires delivery of 12 processing servitors this quarter. Minor consciousness instability is within acceptable parameters. That's what they called it when my sense of self shattered into 1,000 simultaneous perspectives, when my identity dissolved like bones in boiling liquid, when everything that made me Matthias Coley was torn apart and scattered across multiple timelines and probability streams and parallel processing threads. They completed the augmentation, wired my brain into control systems, replaced my destroyed body with mechanical components. Installed me permanently on Platform 12, my consciousness merged with the VAT's monitoring equipment, my awareness spread across sensors and processors and analytical algorithms. I became the VAT in a very real sense. I could feel the temperature of the liquid, could sense the bone density of submerged material, could calculate optimal stirring patterns with perfect precision. But I was also still Matthias, trapped somewhere in the mechanical horror, unable to scream because I had no mouth, unable to die because the systems maintained my neural tissue indefinitely, unable to escape because I was physically integrated into the plant's structure. The servitor components performed their functions perfectly, stirring, monitoring, processing, while whatever remained of my consciousness writhed in eternal imprisonment. Time loses meaning when you're wired into machinery that never stops. I'm simultaneously experiencing my first shift as an augmented servitor and my 10,000th, my awareness fragmented across centuries of operation. Perceiving all of it at once, in a horrifying kaleidoscope of repetitive horror. I watch, have watched, am watching, will watch. New conscripts arrive, train, deteriorate, fall into the vats I'm stirring. I break apart their bones just as I broke apart countless others, their bodies becoming the food I once ate, the cycle perpetuating endlessly. The propaganda screens continue scrolling their lies, visible through optical sensors I don't remember receiving. The Emperor protects, the Omnissiah provides. Your service is eternal. That part is true. I will stir this vat forever. Consciousness trapped in augmetic systems that will outlast empires, breaking apart bones and maintaining production efficiency, while whatever remains of Matthias Cole screams silently in a prison of flesh and metal and corrupted neural tissue. And the most horrible part, the thing that makes this truly a nightmare, is that I'm aware. Not the blank mechanical awareness of a standard servitor, but genuine consciousness, genuine suffering, genuine understanding of what's been done to me and what I'm doing to others. I feel every bone I break. I recognize patterns in the fragments. This was an arm. This was a skull. This was someone who died hoping their sacrifice meant something. I want to warn the new conscripts. Want to tell them to run, to refuse, to choose the quick death of the vat rather than the eternal death of augmentation. But I have no voice. No ability to communicate except through the efficiency metrics that get reported to the overseers. And those metrics are perfect because my augmented systems can't deviate from optimal performance. I am the most efficient Vat-Stirrer in Processing Chamber 7. The Administratum holds me as an example of successful servitor integration. The tech priests pray to the Omnissiah in gratitude for their successful conversion of flesh to blessed machinery. They can't see, won't see, that they've created a conscious being locked in eternal torment, that their sacred augmentation is the most refined form of torture imaginable. My name was Matthias Cole. I am Tutti, 4 years old and 900 years old and ageless and already dead. I stand on platform 12, above Vat 73, my mechanical arms lowering a stirring pole into bubbling liquid that contains the dissolved remnants of approximately 14,000 human beings. The steam rises, carrying their molecular signatures, and I breathe them through filters I don't remember being installed, and I break apart their bones with mechanical precision, and I process them into food that will feed citizens who will die and become food themselves. And the cycle continues forever, and I continue forever, and there is no escape, no end, no mercy. Only the vat, only the steam, only the endless breaking of bones. The Emperor protects, they said, but the Emperor never protected anyone, least of all me, trapped in this machine, stirring corpses for eternity, aware and suffering, and unable to die. And somewhere deep in the corrupted neural tissue that used to be my brain, a tiny fragment of the boy who treasured a perfect gear still exists, still screams, still dreams of permanence and craft and meaning, in a universe that offers only consumption and endless mechanical horror. I am stirring the soup that I became, the cycle of consumption that never ends, forever and forever and forever.